And welcome back to V Road, CCTCG's weekly Vanguard podcast. I'm Cole.
And I'm Trey.
And I'm Jared.
And today we've got a pretty opinionated piece. There's a lot of decks in the game, and we have quite a few that we have pretty, if not mixed, strong opinions about at the very least. So we wanted to kind of talk about decks that we think are pretty underrated and not a lot of people play, or just don't think much of and don't see a reason to take to a tournament, or just even to their locals, and also overrated decks where we understand why they're strong, or maybe we don't. But the thing is that we don't think that they earn the hype they get for the most part, I suppose is the best way to put it.
Yeah, there's a lot of decks in this game. Obviously, there are so many just ride line specific, and that's not including promo bosses and everything I know. But between everything, there's just so many decks that can be played at any point in time, and some of them we think should be played more, and some of them we think are probably overplayed just a bit.
And a big thing here is just because we call a deck overrated or something doesn't mean we think it's bad. We just think the amount of people who are playing it, who are dedicating themselves, is a little more than we think it deserves.
Yep. So I think we'll kind of bounce around here, but we'll definitely start with an underrated deck. And the first one I want to talk about is one I know both Trey and I have played before. And it's Ryandra. He's a deck that is pretty okay, not pretty. He's never topped. He's not really played, just for the most part. But he's a deck that can't really get rushed super easily because he never needs to discard for his ride deck except for the first one. And his board is produced by his act, or his auto, I guess, that can't really be manipulated by the opponent too much unless you're playing against like prison and they can imprison something from your soul. But it just feels like a really solid deck that gets great numbers, and I don't know why more people don't try it, especially when it got a guard restrict recently. I feel like that kind of helped it eke out wins where it normally wouldn't.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, okay, you told me you were gonna hide some from me, and I see why. Every time I play against this deck, my eyes roll in the back of my head when I'm on grade 2 and you go 40, 30, 30, 30, and I'm just like, Jesus Christ.
Yep,
I cannot deal with this. I'm just sitting here with my hand of no guard value, and I'm like, oh, I might just be dead if you hit one or two good triggers. And I didn't think about the fact that I've never seen that card in a tournament result.
Yeah.
It's an interesting one because it has a very set combo, so I can understand why some people don't like playing it because it does the exact same thing every turn. Like Cole was saying, there's not a whole lot of decks that do soul manipulation to your opponent other than really prison, and that's just one card that does it. I mean, yes, you have Orv in the deck or whatever, but not very often will someone re-ride that 4 times. So it's always an interesting one. Um, it 4 attacks, does it every turn that it can at grade 3. So it's agreed. I think it's underrated. Should be played more, I think.
I think probably the one thing holding it back is that while it does something pretty consistent and it's a rather solid deck overall, and it's doing something pretty unique to itself as well, it's just not super flashy, and it's not a deck from either the anime or the side story or a manga or anything. So it has it's got nothing to grab anybody with outside of what it is. And I can see why that keeps it under the radar for a lot of people. But especially for how cheap it is to build, I think it's a worthwhile pickup.
Yeah, and for a deck that does the same thing consistently, it doesn't use resources much at all. Like, you're using maybe a counterblast a turn, and that's if you have the grade 3. You're maybe spending 3 energy a turn, which you are, getting every turn if you have the grade 2 on board. So or you're putting it on board, I should say. So it's a really interesting, kind of easy, loose, open deck to play, and it's not one that you can necessarily turn your brain off to play, but you kind of can. You can just kind of go autopilot. You don't have to stress about it. Just keep a good hand and swing for big numbers.
Yeah, for sure. So what do we have next after that?
I think a very underrated deck, and this one not everyone agrees with me. I think Fennel is actually a very underrated deck. And the biggest thing I have to say to it is yes, it is a 3 attack deck, and that's not great. I get that. But when 99% of the time at grade 3, you're 3 attacking, but you're pushing 5 damage in those 3 swings. Like, that's kind of crazy, first off, which 5 damage is a lot. So having to say pretty much PG or GG 2 different attacks for certain, not including drive checks, just because the number, like the power is really good, the criticals are really good. So, and it's just consistent. Like, I mean, you run Stregas in it because you're already playing a bunch of orders. You have a little bit of your opponent board manipulation. You draw a bunch. Like you just kind of stay in that fairly consistent area. Sometimes the hand is kind of false because you have a bunch of orders in the deck, but I think it's really underrated.
Yeah, it's a weird one. Like, I come up against it here and there on our locals, and I don't think the deck's bad at all. It does do a lot of deck thinning, and it can use lyrical generics pretty well. But I just think that it getting a crit early, if your drop zone is set up well enough, is pretty impactful. What I've noticed though is that it does suffer a lot from like weirdly low numbers early. It's like Gondiva if Gondiva was a fox girl and gave something else a crit, but didn't have more than 3 attacks. And the thing they both share or rather have in common is that their first turn 3 is usually like, it can be pretty threatening, but it usually is like just not threatening enough. So I can see why, like, when we talk about other decks, we'll see that they have some pretty crazy turn 3s, and this deck just like kind of does. I think the one thing it definitely has on its side for the most part is some pretty crazy deck thinning.
Yeah, I think it's pretty good at grinding out some games. Like if it's you don't have a whole bunch of cards in hand. It's good at burning it because you have to throw down some larger number of cards and later in the end. Which, I mean, obviously you can get a lot of effects like that in stride decks and everything else, but at the same time, there isn't that guaranteed crit on things. And so just the consistency of the 5 damage and 3 attacks is astronomical. So that's why I think it's underrated.
I have a weirdly skewed opinion because every time I play against that deck, I'm on like one of the defensive monsters of the format that her numbers don't look that impressive. I'm either on Siana or I'm on Lascaria the past couple times I've played against it, where I just like, I look at your 33 and I'm just like, okay, that's 1 card, and I just like don't care.
Yeah, I guess so. That's fair. I suppose.
I it's a weirdly skewed opinion, but I understand where you're coming from with that.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't had anybody play like Gondiva lately, and they're like trying to win in a similar way, but the advantage of that deck is it has more than 3 attacks. So obviously it doesn't get more than 3 going first on its turn 3. So they share that. They're only showing you 3 attacks on their first grade 3 turn, but I think beyond that, this deck can just like weirdly struggle to close out games. I don't know what it's really missing to do that, but maybe like a guard restrict, I guess.
That'd be crazy. But
yeah,
would be good for it. Who knows? We'll see.
Sure. So what do we got next?
All right. Are we moving on? I think I will start the glitter round table. I think we'll just get those all out of the way. My favorite, so of the glitter decks, my favorite is Chaos, and I genuinely think this deck needs, like, it's getting 1 more piece soon, and I think that'll finally put it into a place that I think it'll actually compete in the meta again. Because if you've seen the tournament results, like, from the past sets, there's always one Chaos hiding in all of it. It's 1 to 2 Chaos players always sneak out atop. I do not understand how they can keep on doing it in a format where they don't get anything new. But every time I play it, I'm just like, here's 5 attacks. 33 is going to be the smallest you deal with this turn, and there's a crit. It's just like, there's so much that this deck throws at people and puts so much pressure on that I think it's just one small thing from breaking back into the meta, because it keeps on getting that gas out.
Yeah, it's a weird one. I don't know. It's the Dark States Classic. It went right up there next to Baron Magnus back in like early standard of being a glass cannon deck. Like, it doesn't plus much, if at all. What it does plus, it needs to use to keep going and get to 13 soul. And once it gets to 13 soul, it feels like pretty crispy. But for the most part, what it has that some other decks just still don't is a really strong, like, going first turn 3, where you do, like you said, you have 5 attacks and you can get a crit early as well. So if you're not exactly doing a lot of plussing yourself, you're doing a lot of minusing of your opponent's hand, which is in some ways just as defensive to lower their potential ceiling. So
Yeah, and I have to rate it at least underrated, because I just played a game against Jared where he was playing Chaos and I was playing Odium, and I died at grade 2 after playing a Distorted Bane to draw a card and then drawing 2 cards for putting it in my zone. So it's I had a good hand for being at grade 2, but still went from 2 to 5 or 2 to 6 really quick. Died. Luckily, it was a best of 3. But yeah, that was the numbers got crazy, giving 10k to everything. Getting to that 13, 5 attacks. I was dead. So Chaos also holds a place in my heart. So yeah, just good overall deck.
Yep.
Yeah, and he the grade 1 order, One Who Governs Chaos, is actually the secret sauce of that deck that most people don't actually like understand is the reason they're dying, because it just deck thins. It builds board, it gives power to board, it does literally everything the deck wants to do. And I noticed that in my games today is games I lost did not have that order. Games I won had that order. Like, it's almost a 1-to-1 correlation.
yeah, I guess while we're here, we should do a quick checkup on the other glitter decks that we think deserve a mention, at least. Like, I think as a blanket statement, all of them are fairly underrated. I think they are, number one, like a really good budget option for new players, and they can compete. I think they're at the lowest rung of what I think a deck needs to be able to do to compete. But if decks like Chaos are popping up and like topping recently, like here and there, that enough tells me that they've given them enough support to kind of set them on their way. And if they pick up newer generic cards or what have you along the way, then great. But I think overall they're all kind of in a similar spot where they can all do something to catch a meta deck off guard. And in that same vein as Chaos, I think Aroa, even before his new form, which we will mention here in a sec, can hit pretty hard, getting itself a crit as well on its first turn 3. It's not getting more than 4 attacks, but it is making, like Radilina pretty big with the amount of power that you can give to the little dragon guy. And the one thing that this deck does the best with to kill an opponent is hitting an overtrigger. And I know that like hitting an overtrigger does just auto kill, like, okay, I wouldn't necessarily say overtriggers just like auto kill the opponent, especially early in the game. But when you put it on the little dragon and then Radilina copies that, and if you're going second and you have the grade 3 Radilina in your hand, then you have 3 100 million K swings. And that is almost impossible for most decks to guard, especially if there's a crit somewhere in there, which at least Roa will have, so you'll probably be choking a PG out of them for that. And I think that, like, I don't think there's a game that can be lost when you offensively hit an OT with this deck.
Yeah, Cole, your game plan. Just in your deck that doesn't deck thin a lot, just hit the OT. I like that game plan.
Yeah, the deck thins out is like mid game and no sooner.
So with Roa, I like every time I play against it, it's a really good 5 damage deck, in that it can put me to 5 damage. I hate to be mean, but I've struggled to lose to Roa unless I'm playing like actual jank. But I do think when it gets its new form, just gonna fucking like skyrocket that deck. So if you have the core, which guess what, you're gonna want to play your Radilinas in the new form of deck. Wow, big surprise. So while I don't think it is like that great right now, I do think it's worth picking up for that next form that it's gonna get to get that like consistency, because I think that's really what's hurting it the most.
For sure.
Yeah. And then obviously moving on from those, Ava. Ava's Ava. Poison in Paradise is really good. It doesn't use any resources. The new monster promo that I say new, the newer monster promo that it got a while back, still is just so darn good to get. It gives you a reason to use your energy. It's always on the board. It always is looking for your poison and paradises. You always have something to put them back into the deck, so you can just keep the cycle going over and over and over again. You can call everything out of your deck and deck thin like crazy, so you're just getting down to those triggers. So it's never going to be bad. So I think it is underrated because it probably could still be played really well. And I know I've had some playtesting games over the last couple weeks with some people who've just been grinding Ava and still play it really well against Odium, against Levidros, against Varga, against Rezael. So it's still playing against good top meta decks. It's just a good deck.
Yeah, like I genuinely think Ava's biggest problem, it's been meta for so long. People are just tired of playing this. There are just not that many soldiers left who are like, yeah, I want to keep playing Ava.
Yep. So I think we can go into the first overrated deck. We have a couple more underrated ones, but I do want to kind of go back and forth a little bit. And this one is a little contentious, I think, because while it, and this one is going to be a little pedantic, I know, but just hear me out. So I think as much as people are comfortable with it and they know it pretty well at this point, I do think Rezael is overrated. So the reason I think that is it is specific to the current builds of the deck, and what I think keeps this deck as relevant as it is the dog. Like when we are talking about this game and we know that the dog is, like not banned or choice restricted with this card, it sounds really dumb and like it doesn't really feel worth mentioning that this deck is overrated, but I do think that its ability to perform just in general, being reliant so much on this one card, speaks about how the deck is. Like when it comes to Varga, you do need to see a couple pieces, but for the most part, Varga is like Overlord. Like he himself is the one deck engine of like your win con for that deck. He just needs to restand enough times, and usually you win that way. And also with his board wipe, he kind of just does everything for the deck, and everything else kind of plays off of him. Levidros is a bit more piece reliant, but he is still like, he's got the markers and the markers are drawing, and like it's all these things that where they're doing everything for their deck, and Rezael like has to work in complete tandem with his rear guards to be able to generate the advantage it needs to throughout the game in like a steady way, or it's just not gonna get there. It's just not gonna have enough shield, or it's It's not going to find the pieces it needs, like Gabuelius that you're running as a 2 of, and the other Rezile that you don't always find. And it's just, I don't know. I agree that, like, I think that this is the best deck in the format right now, like, by far. Well, okay, not even by far, but it is, like, clear and obvious to me why it's the best deck in the format, but I don't attribute that really to the deck itself. I attribute it to one card, if I'm being honest.
Yeah, with, like, his whole skill... Azael actually doesn't do a whole lot of himself. His whole thing is that he makes other units be able to do things. Like, he just keeps on bringing them back. And after playing against, like, either, like, games where you don't find dogs, or games where we tested out where dog was just, like, not... We took dog out to try out. When it, like, man, that deck would be so much more fair to play against if it wasn't going, oh, top 2 draw, top 2 draw, top 2 draw, like 3 times a turn because of dog. And it makes it so it does feel a little, like, I agree that I think it's overrated only because I hear so many people bemoan this stupid 1-drop dog. Like, that is the only reason I think people don't realize that deck is being propped up by this $30 promo card.
Yeah, so I do think Rezile is and isn't overrated. Like, I lean more towards the fact that I don't think it's overrated. I think it is just a consistently good deck. Especially because it has the advantage of being a Keter deck. And with it being a Keter deck, Keter has the best generics. So in a deck that doesn't run a lot of cards that say specific name lock rear guards to Rezile, it gets away with a lot of stuff. So, like, I think obviously the dog is one of the best cards in the game, and yes, that is fantastic. But I think, like, obviously the current build is the order package with teeth felts and dogs. But at the same time, the Cadwalla build I think is just as good. Because in reality, your Nilburises are doing your soul charging for you, so you're soul blasting them out to be able to call them back from Rezile's skill. I think that build is honestly just as good as the Teethfall build. It's just you have to play it slightly differently. Um, which isn't really all that different because it still does the same thing Rezile wants to do. Is it wants to draw a bunch of cards. It wants to call cards to board from hand, and then you want to sacrifice those things to draw more cards, and then you counterblast to call more cards back. So I think its base engine, I think, is good enough to the point where you can change the build up in a couple different fashions and still get a good enough outcome in different like topping lists. That way, I don't necessarily agree with it being overrated. I do think Dog is like such a good card, but not the entire engine of the deck when Rezile himself can still just work with a lot of pieces.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. Like, I think this deck, out of all the ones I'll bring up today, is the closest to being on the verge to being an overrated deck. The only thing that I think is overrated about it really is that the deck itself, like, a Rezile as a card is what makes the deck strong. I think the strongest part about him is that, like you mentioned, he doesn't ask anything specific of you, and you have free reign to really run whatever you want in him. So all the good generic cards you have are unfettered by anything that could hold them back, that they might be in, like, Orions and Leo or something in Varga that wouldn't really like to be retired or something like that. So the base concept of how generic this card is what makes it the deck strong. And I don't think the deck would be bad without the dog. Like, not even close. I do think this deck would still be able to compete, but there would be a much bigger difference in the amount of consistency the deck has when you're using a card like that can be looped in such a consistent way. Especially because, like, Cadwal is a similar card that can be looped, especially because he retires himself to do his skill. So in the same way as the dog, so you can bring him back immediately and a way that what is it? A Nilberius can't be because he goes into the soul and stuff like that. But what kind of bums me out about this deck is how generic it is, I guess. Because I really like Angel Feather, and Angel Feather did have a history with calling cards from drop zone and doing stuff with its damage zone. So when I play cards like the grade 0 that it got in set 2, or set 3 rather, that can, or set 4, it that can like intercept from the back row, and so you're incentivized to intercept with it every turn and then call it back out, and it'll give 10k to something. Like, that's really cool, and that is similar to how an Angel Feather deck played in V. And it kind of bums me out that the whole deck doesn't play that way. When there's no reason to. You should just be looping all these insane advantage pieces. I don't know. We talk about this deck a lot on this podcast, but
I mean,
it's the main character deck.
Yeah,
I'm about to say main character deck.
And I play it a lot. Yeah, I play it a lot. And I do like it for what it is.
In tournament, its tournament results are still there. It keeps on doing it. So as long as this deck stays relevant, we'll probably. Who knows? The next time I'm on in like 20 episodes, I will probably talk about it again.
Yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to get, as far as like the current meta goes of this deck, I just want it to be choice restricted with the dogs so bad, because I want to see this deck be innovated on beyond what new advantage piece can we put in, like, because I know Cadwalla was not a card that people had initially considered, but then around like set 2 and set 4 they did. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I'm glad that there are at the very least, I'm glad that there are different builds for the deck, but I really, really want to see something like, I want them to make good cards for this deck that make you not want to play a generic, so it can feel more unique and less, I guess, eye-rolly when people are like, oh, Keter Pile. I think that's the thing that's overrated about it, is how much people groan about Keter Pile, because while I don't like it, for the reasons I've just stated, it's the main thing is how people react to it, I guess. I don't know.
I'm one of those people who begroan Keter Pile, but that's just because I like playing like mid-powered decks, and I just love seeing, all right, how to start building this deck. Okay, just drop your $200 on Keter Pile really quick.
Yeah.
And then your Vanguard, and I'm just like, okay, why would I not just play like Razel?
Yeah.
But that has been the Raziel Power Hour.
Yeah. Yep, I don't know. I could keep going. This deck,
yeah,
it's my favorite deck. I love this deck right now. It's like my favorite deck, but there are things about it that, while I think the generic package that it has is something it needs to compete, I do not like that it needs the whole package to compete. I like playing other decks that need pieces of that package to do a little bit better than it would otherwise, but it just kind of rubs me the wrong way when I'm playing this deck as long as I have, and there's like only one card in the deck, or like 2 cards, I guess, now that actually care about the fact that you're playing Rezo. I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Alright, you want me to hit us with another?
Go off, King. Go off, King.
Alright, I'm gonna talk about a deck I actually just despise, but it's Varga. I genuinely despise this deck in design. I do not have fun playing against it, but oh my god, the number of times I've looked at their like actual book of a hand, swing my like 20k into them, and they go, I can't guard this, just baffles me. The number of times the deck does that. It's so funny that I'll just be like, I'm playing Archite, I swing with my like 23 and a crit, and they're like, I take it. I'm like, what? It's one card, dude. Like, the deck just keeps on doing that. Like, I don't like the board wipe. I don't like the fact that it now attacks for 58 on its like first Persona right turn when it Rakshasas, but the number of times I've seen it die when any other deck wouldn't just means I do not think it's as good.
Yeah, this one's it's kind of a funny one, because it as little as good generics Dragon Empire has, you really only run 2 generics out of it. So it's kind of a funny one, because it feels like it runs more generic than it actually does. Like obviously you run the Guncycler because that card is just great. You don't use a whole lot of energy in the deck. There is an ability to use the whole bunch if you run, and specifically use all of it, but um, you don't most of the time. So you have enough to be able to draw and do things like that with it. Um, I obviously Rakshasa made the deck way better, making it so that, well, first off, you do get to Persona Ride even though you're switching forms, as well as you no longer have the restriction of having to divines at 4 damage, which that was like the worst part about old Varga. Um, but that deck, it's still just so good. Like it's fast to the point. Like you're still on that first turn, you're still retiring your opponent's front row, so you're like they're still gotta hesitate to like want to build a board. You're still getting 2 attacks from your Vanguard. You're still drawing from your ride line because your grade 2 comes out and you're drawing off of that. And you're just drawing a good enough cards so that by the time you're really going into that turn 4, that's when you can kind of really just flood the board, say, I'm going to hit everything. I'm going to call, the worms back and be able to like just have these big columns and things and kind of keep a consistent board. Um, Even though it retires everything on the board. So I think, I don't know. I'm in a weird spot. I think it is very, very good of a deck. And I think it should probably be played just a little bit more than what it is. But I can understand the points of it being overrated, and the point that, yeah, it can have some false hands.
Okay. You both make great points. All right. And I think they're all valid. But I think specifically when it comes to this deck, out of any other deck we'll talk about today, if it's overrated, there are very clear reasons. The first two is, one, people love the character who plays it in the anime. Like, they are obsessed with this character. Sleeves of this character go for 4 times as much as sleeves for other characters right now. Her energy generator is the reason you play this game competitively right now. And number 2 is it's a dragon. And it is really the only current incarnation of Dragonic Overlord style of gameplay that is played right now. Like, there are no other decks in this game competitively played to a wide enough of a volume that do what this deck does, because it does it so well, and because they just haven't really been making a lot of restanding Vanguards lately, which is interesting. But I think there's a concept in this game that doesn't really have a name, and it's hard to describe. But when I think of like a deck that can plus a lot, like Trey, you mentioned that this deck does draw a lot. However, I did notice that when I played it, albeit before Rakshasa came out, I noticed that the deck has a lot of early game, what I like to call like game action advantage that all decks have, where or all decks can have, where like they're recouping costs from like a ride deck, or they're doing things that make it so that they'll have a pretty big hand going into their first turn 3, or so on and so forth. But what it doesn't do is plus like after that at all. Like, I remember a lot of people kind of rolled their eyes when it got a card that helped it build a board. But then when you play that deck and you realize like, whoa, okay, I don't actually plus at all. I go even on almost everything, and going even in this game is not bad. Like, there are a lot of decks, even competitively now, that don't break even on the game actions they need to make to like have good pressure. But the fact that that's mostly what all this deck does, for as far as its hand goes, is break even on all the things it's doing, means that the smaller its hand gets, the smaller its hand stays until it just dies. And that's why I think, as strong as it is overrated from the merits of, probably just because it's played by a really popular character. I think a lot of people play it for that reason alone.
Yeah, I think maybe it's a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy, but like, how many have top aided in the past 2 months?
Not actually as many as you'd think, It's weird. to think
One.
about, but
One in
Yeah.
all in non-Japanese format.
Yeah.
We play global because we you were those couple months behind. But there is like I was looking through lists and I only saw one top 8 in the past 2 months. There was one that also got they're like top 24, I think. So good for them as well. But
You know, Trey, I kind of feel your sentiment though, where it's like hard to truly say it's over or underrated. Or okay, I think it's easy to say it's both over and underrated because as much as people complain about the design space that it inhabits, where it's become less interactive as far as its divine skill goes, and how strong people say it is, I do agree that like it could be played more, I think. If I'm being honest, I think it could, and I'm surprised it's not played more. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a tough one, and that one's no one's ever going to be with all of these.
Yeah.
No one's ever going to be correct about one thing or the other. We're just throwing our opinions out there. So, obviously, like we don't have to agree on everything, and that's the best part about these discussions. Is, yeah, I just remember you playing my Varga and being like, "Wow, this deck really just doesn't do a lot." And I was like, "Yeah, I can see what you're saying," but
Yeah,
at the same time, it's fast, it can rush, it does what it needs to do early enough that it can catch a lot of decks off guard.
it's really good at filtering normal units out of its hand and onto its board, and then not drawing any more beyond that.
oh, but see, my favorite is when they use the divine, you hit like one good defensive, and now their deck is like just Draconic Overlord and nothing. Like not even like a good, like not even the end. It's just Draconic Overlord now.
Yep. It is
Yeah, no.
next to like Leo Odium, where it's I say there's actually a lot of divine skill decks that if you survive their divine turn, they are like it is like night and day how strong they are. Because if you can live through Varga's divine turn, man, his second swing is like really pathetic.
When he looks at you and goes 35, and you're like, okay, I at least know the number. No drive checks. Okay, two triggers down. We're good.
Yep.
Yeah. So that brings me to my next overrated deck, and this one maybe it's kind of gone out of play a little bit, but I think Blankmeyer is overrated. I think he was great in the show. I thought it was so fun that it kind of deletes the Vanguard in a sense, and it's a fun skill, and it can hit some really good numbers, but it has the same problem every Soul Charge deck does, is you just don't have control over what you're soul charging. And it has honestly, now that Varga has Rakshasa, it has the easiest divine skill to play around, because you just say, okay, I'm gonna hard mull for a PG, or for not PG, for a Persona ride, and then good luck, I guess. I'm just gonna exist until you divines me, and then I'm a Persona ride, and then your divine skill did nothing. I mean, obviously it didn't do nothing. You got a crit. You couldn't use PGs and all against it. But at the same time, I don't know. It feels like the deck's gonna need a lot of specific soul charge to be able to do things. Which the ride line kind of does that, where it like reveals the top couple cards and then you shove the normal units. That's great. But a lot of the other soul charge things that you run in it, and there's some generics that you run like brainwash and things like that to help you with your soul. But it's just it's got the same problem with soul charge decks, and I think it's just overrated.
Yeah, well, honestly, I don't even think that the fact that it's the deck that got worse. I think players just figured out how to play against it, I think is what honestly brought it down. Because it has such an easy play around. Every time I play against it, I'm just like, I'm just gonna guard you early until you use your divine skill, and now like Zamook's kinda threatening is where it puts you. And Zamook's threatening in the way that it's like 20 and a crit. Okay, I guess I will just make sure that one doesn't hit me. And that's just kind of what it comes down to. Is I think people learned, oh, just keep just keep your persona rides. Like keep your Persona rides. Don't like make sure to use your PGs on turns where they don't like.
Don't.
That they don't divine.
Sure. So this one's interesting because I think this is a really good. I think we're gonna look back on this video when we inevitably have a conversation about. They say in set 8, oh wow, or maybe like set 9 or something, when they introduce like a new encounter deck and like, oh, we're putting Chaos Breaker in standard. Oh wow, look, there's Lock and it actually does something this time, not like whatever Messiah did, but this is not the first time where a deck has come out and it's got a pretty let's say interactive mechanic, and it feels like pretty overwhelmingly strong for the first like month or so that it's come out. And then it becomes a lot less played and a lot less talked about once its gimmick is kind of, I guess, solved. And not to say that like you play around Locke and his divine skill in the same way, but I do think that's true, that this deck just isn't, as much as his character is also pretty adored, at least in Japan. And like his aesthetic is super strong. Like it's a Daisuke Izuku deck. Like I've always loved this deck for how it looks and how it plays, because I think what it's doing is kind of creative. And I almost think about like, man, if the new Blankmeyer doesn't need this one and is like sort of its own deck, while probably using a couple pieces, like it definitely feels like a deck that I would play. But for the most part, I do think that if people are playing it now, they gotta have they gotta know some sauce that we don't. Like, I gotta see something crazy. And I think they did try something with like the festival booster, like set orders that all the nations got. And I think that did help the deck. But I don't know what this deck needs now to really push it further than where it was when it was like top dog in the set 2 meta. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to what we're gonna look back on this and be like, wow, we were just stupid. One who walked from 0, Blankmeyer Nexus is just the best card ever printed. Like, it's gonna be really funny when that happens.
It just says like, oh, your opponent can't Persona Ride or something, like tacked onto it, and that's all it needs to say. And then we're like, well,
guys, time to pack it up.
And until that's the case, I think it's overrated.
Yeah, people think it's really cool, and he does look really cool. But when your cool thing gets stopped by your opponent keeping grade 3 in hand.
All right. This is the one big curveball of the video.
All right.
I'm specifically targeting Trey, even though you're not really like, you literally don't even play this deck in tournament. But I think you know where I could be going. But it's the Bat.
Batman!
Okay, so this one I don't think we'll have much to say, if I'm being honest. Like, I only think it's overrated because how many people are like hopping onto the trend of playing this in a tournament and topping with it. And I don't think this deck is bad, obviously. If it's topping as much as it is, it's obviously a good deck. But I do think it is like just so interesting that this is where we're at right now. And I almost wonder if this deck is topping as much as it is because people don't know how to play an early game. Maybe.
Yeah.
Like if they're not like guarding early, this deck probably isn't that impressive. If you know what this deck is trying to do to you, then it doesn't. I don't think this is any harder to play around than like Blankmeyer. Even if like playing around a rush deck is harder to do, I think overall, because there are decks nowadays like Levidross that need a lot of its pieces in its hand, so it could just die to this. And there are other decks that I can think of too that like don't really want to guard early and they don't like keeping triggers in their opening hand and all that stuff. But I don't know, I just don't see it as much as I see it.
I do think this deck gets a lot of what I'll call whiplash value, where people go, "You're playing what?" as you ride Edelgama, because I think most of them use the Archetype ride line, which Archetype is
Right.
like a reasonable deck to bring to a tournament. But then you hit them with the Batman, and then they just like get attacked 5 times, and 3 of them are by this stupid bat, and they just die. And they just die. It's just so funny.
It's it's so funny because it's come a long ways, and obviously we were super excited when set 4 and set 5 started introducing cards for the promo bosses. Like when Petrarca got her card, like we were like, oh, holy shit, it's happening. When Spinal Marquee got a couple cards, and then obviously Edelglama got some stuff, and it's really great. But it's so funny because Edelglama's biggest problem is you ran too many orders and you didn't have enough consistency of building board. But the decks really kind of transitioned to being just an Archetype Junior, where it's all
Sure.
monsters. You run the monster PGs. It's new grade 2 and 1 from set 5 are both monsters. Edaglama himself is a monster. So you're playing the Archetype ride line to find the research order. You're playing the research order each turn. You're grabbing 2 cards. You're running Savoid in the deck, so you can just find it, and then you can Soul Blast too, because you're not using your soul for pretty much anything else to call a board. So you kind of have a fairly consistent board with it. And I mean, its skill of being able to restand itself as well as rear guards and doing that multiple times, depending on how many orders you have in the thing. It's a sneaky deck. So I don't necessarily think it's overrated personally. I can see what you're saying by that. Um, but I think actually it's for what it is. It's kind of in a really fun spot.
I think it's kind of been a flavor of the month style deck where it's
Yeah,
like,
I think
oh
so
wait,
too.
this thing is doing great, and I honestly might try it because this deck doesn't look that hard to put together considering I have Archetype, so I'll have to maybe Badger Cole for like some dark, what is it? The
Oh, like
Orphis one.
some
Dark
Orpheus
Knight.
set ordered or
Yeah,
something. Maybe. I don't know
but
if I have any of those still,
but
but
yeah,
we'll see.
this feels just like plain Archetype, but then you just like shoot everything at your opponent on turn 3 and pray that they're dead afterwards. Which, hey, I think against some of the current decks right now, that just works. Because
Yeah,
like,
I see what it's going for. I see it. I
yeah,
do. It makes sense. What it does like literally can kill even meta decks. I just think, like you said, Jared, it feels super trendy. It's
yeah.
like a funny thing to do, but I don't know. I think the more I see this deck pop up in the future, the more overrated I think it is. you know.
I can't necessarily argue that. It is definitely fun, and nice to see a promo boss kind of hitting some top lists.
Yeah, for sure. I think so.
We don't get that
Yeah,
often.
like what? Like last time was like Graham Gase, like what, 2 centuries ago?
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Next,
that's right. It
it's
did
got to be
have some
Spinal
stuff.
Marquee next. Please be Spinal Marquee
Yeah,
next.
okay, dude.
We need more Dino Dragons. That's what I'm saying. Please, come on. Just it's so easy. He's right there.
Look,
He's
if you
ready
can
for
get
the
a
taking.
Spino Marquise Tots, I can get a Hex Orb one. You know, I'm just saying.
It's true. Maybe new X-Orb form.
We don't need a new form. The form is good enough. All the rear guards suck.
That's
Okay,
fair.
we really only have a couple left. I think we can get through pretty quick. Whoever wants to pick up from here.
I have an underrated one
Yeah.
that I think um obviously there's a set coming up that's going to fix a lot of its current problems, but I think Mygo as a deck is one of, if not the most, it's probably not the most, but it's one of the most consistent decks in the game because you run all the names and you just find them, and a bunch of them search for each other. Your ride line searches for different MyGo units. Like you're able to just kind of do what you want, and it draws enough cards. It binds its own pieces so that they're kind of out of the way. They don't get disturbed. Um, you have cards that give extra shield and bind themselves. You call from bind. You search your deck and your drop for a song to sing. And it's just like it doesn't put out ridiculous numbers, but it has a little bit of guard restrict. It has an extra drive when your opponent's grade 3, so It's just honestly a sneaky good deck, and I think people kind of move past it faster than they should have.
So on one hand, crossover deck, chat, get 'em. On the other hand, I want to remind people that this deck came out alongside Shiranui in Japan and was consistently topping next to Shiranui, one of the best decks we've seen in this game, like in this format. And it like the one problem it had was it's a weird crossover deck, so that it just didn't get things like ever. And the fact that it's going to get new things, I think will honestly just help bring it back up. As much as I don't like crossover decks. But
I mean, for us, it came out in set 1 of Divines alongside like Rezael and Varga, and like those were tier 1 decks out of the gate. But so was Mygo. Like that deck was actually really, really solid out the gate, and that was back when like I said, like Shiranui was still popping, and that deck put up a good fight against literally all of them. And you can like play it now, and I think it's I personally still consider it a tier 1 deck. I think it is very consistent, and it has like really decent shield, and it kind of deals with its own board in enough to like dodge decks like Varga or like any decks that happen to have some amount of a retire to try to snipe your pieces. So yeah, I do agree actually. That's like one I just don't see anymore as much as I think it can still compete, especially with how easy it is to build. Like you said, just all the names, and it's very cheap for that too.
So cheap as a deck. It obviously just got a new promo just a couple weeks ago. But I honestly for EV3 to is pretty much just grab a card. It's pretty good. So yeah, I mean, we're playing it a couple weeks ago, playing against Rezael, playing against Odium, and seeing actually it fare fairly well still. Obviously once the latest more like Mygo, Morphonica, the Bang Dream set that's coming up, I think it's going to help the deck a lot. I think there's going to be some new interesting forms, maybe some alternate boss units, or at least orders or songs, to make the deck probably a little more consistent. But which is crazy to say when it's already as consistent as I think it's going to be really good, and it has an untapped resource like nothing EVs in the deck other than the one grade 1 song. So there's some room to play with, and I'm looking forward to it.
I think besides that, we don't have too many left. I know that Jared, I don't know if you had any more. Oh, I think
I've said my pieces, but I guess I can be the talking point for the fact that Hari and Night Rose, the Stride deck sets that just came out, are very hype. They're very, very beloved characters, and they are fine. Like they're not bad. I saw what Night Rose could do. Hari doesn't look like it's going to be too insane. Honestly, the big problems with those are what they do to premium, but that's not what we're talking about today.
Yeah,
So they're reasonable. They're going to see a
yeah.
lot of play because they're Stride decks of popular bosses.
Stride decks will always be super highly played in the first couple months of their release, and these two I know have like a really big history of how popular they are. Like people love their characters from the anime, and people also just love like the playstyles of these decks being like the drop zone and the soul, and like using those in interesting ways. But I look at these decks and like, yes, the Night Rose deck draws a lot, and it can build a hand pretty consistently, and about as much as a Rezael can, if not a little bit more actually. Especially because it doesn't need to build as much of a board from its own hand that like some decks have to do. But it's like its fourth stride doesn't even give you a fourth attack, and you have to find a Persona Ride copy in order to like a Persona Stride into the other Night Rose, like the Night Rose Stride, to get 5 attacks in a crit, and something that can easily kill almost any deck. But it feels like, weirdly enough, that how consistently it can fill up its drop, that feels like all it can, and draw, like that's all it can do. And that is enough to live through most games, but I don't think that if it's performing super well in Japan, I don't know how, if I'm being honest. I guess, well, they have other stuff as well. They have other things going on, but I don't know. It just feels like a deck that does well when I don't know if it should as much as it is. I don't know.
Well, and it's kind of interesting because some of the build and a lot of the builds in Japan are leaning towards like a hostage style package where you run the grade 2 order from Festival Collection that literally just says move a card from guard to there. So I mean, with how much it recuperates from drop and so easy, like you just stride, you counterblast, you call a unit. Okay. You call it PG. It's not a great booster, but if you call it from your stride skill, it's literally counterblast, call a card, give it 2k. So it becomes an 8k booster, which is just like most other things, and it's a PG the next turn. So
Oh, I'm tired of seeing. Well, why is this Stride deck still played? Oh, because it just hostages you.
yeah,
Can we just restrict the crest of those cards? I'm just
I mean, it also once it's fully built out with the grade 4 searching grade 3 that allows you to pull Night Rose back to your hand from drop once it's placed. Like it can get consistently into the second stride where you are able to 5 attack with it. So some of it is also just build types and getting things there. And if you can get it to consistently 5 attack, that's how the deck wins.
Sure.
But if you're just going into Obadiah and you're just 3 attacking, hitting good numbers but not great, you don't do a lot. You just exist. So
Yeah, like I know why these decks can win. I understand completely, but it just feels like and obviously it's not a bad thing. Like when a new deck like these come out, it's super hyped up and people are always looking at like what their rear guards can do and stuff like that. But these two just feel very I guess to me it's less that they're overrated and more that it's very bizarre that they win as much as they do when they have no rear. Like I think as far as Night Rose goes, at least I don't know as much about Hari, but it doesn't have like a rear guard that enables another attack, or or something along the lines of like the grade 2 and Chrono Jet that can get a grade 1 that can draw you a card that can deck thin a bunch. Like I don't know, it's just weird. It just feels weird. I think obviously they came out last week as of the date of recording, but so we still need to get acquainted with them, I guess. But for now, it feels like just another stride deck to me, I guess. I don't know.
has the same problems all stride decks do. So
Yeah,
probably a little overrated. Great nostalgia, great character, great deck, great art. Probably a little overrated.
But other than that, I don't think we have any more decks to cover unless there is one we're just dying to mention.
I got nothing. I think I spent my piece on this today. There are some honorable mentions for some underrated, like Tamiyura and the rest of the glitters. Obviously,
Silhouette,
Thagria.
I know you mentioned.
Silhouette was one that I had discussed a little bit. I think it's slightly underrated because it just is fun and consistent, fairly consistent.
Hey, look at the bright side. When we come back to do this in like what 2 sets, because I think this is one we can do this recurring. I'm figuring up some of the other ones we didn't mention.
True. I think Greedon belongs.
Silhouette's gonna get that one promo that changes everything.
Promos do. Oh, the Dark States dog, the little
Dark
fairy
States
girl.
dog, yeah.
That's gonna just
A
make
magazine promo.
That thing's gonna add a bunch of problems for a lot of Dark States decks.
Yeah.
Maybe something that brings a lot of Dark States decks back into relevancy.
But yeah, I think for now that's this one. If you listen all the way through to this point, thanks. It's a big deal to us. And another big deal is how far we've gotten as a channel. I think 75 or so subscribers as this point, maybe a little bit more. And it's honestly like it's not a big deal. It's not the biggest thing ever, but it is cool, and we do appreciate it for what it is. And we hope that we can just keep growing and get more people discussing the game like this, because I think it does add a lot of dimensions to a game that maybe people wouldn't consider would have this much to talk about. But yeah, if you want to keep up with the rest of our content, be sure to hit the bell to be notified when we upload, and like this video if you found the conversation interesting. But until the next one, I was Cole.
Rose Trey.
And I was Jared.
And we'll see you later.